The concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy is a fascinating one to me. The idea that upon the realization of some horrific event in your future, you end up causing the very thing you were trying to avoid. I suppose at its core, it's the kind of story that's meant to display the dangers of trying to conquer external forces such as fate or chance. A classic case of hubris for anyone arrogant enough to attempt it. Simultaneously, they work as a tragedy, with the protagonist motivated not always by the desire to change their future, as much as the simple fear of it. Normally the fear of their own death, resulting in an ever-increasing torrent of irrational actions that are ultimately powerless against the heavy hand of fate. Perhaps the most famous example in classic literature is that of Macbeth, who violently assumes the Scottish throne in fulfillment of a magical prediction, only to have his actions ensure his death. His arrogance, particularly in the disregarding of the witch's prophecy regarding his would-be killer, also condemns him. I don't want you to think I'm snobby though, there are of course hundreds of other examples. Like in Minority Report, John Anderton is accused of a crime by the precogs, and so runs away, in doing so setting in motion the chain of events that could then lead to him committing a murder. If he had never been accused, then he wouldn't have found himself in any of the situations that he was accused of being in. Another great one is Kung Fu Panda, where Shifu sends a messenger to the prison after seeing a vision of Tai Lung escaping. The feather left by the messenger is the very thing that Tai Lung uses to escape, meaning that had Shifu not acted on this prophecy, then Tai Lung would still be behind bars, or in his weird metal padlock thing. It's a great trope, one that I enjoy seeing play out, especially when the characters begin to realise that they are in fact living out their own predictions despite their efforts against it. And yet, many of these examples focus solely on the attempt to avert the outcome that has been given, rather than questioning whether such a prophecy is even true in the first place. The idea of fate or a predetermined outcome is taken as certainty, that if something is not done, and sometimes even if something is done, then the terrible future will indeed come to pass. It's not that the people involved don't play an active role in the fulfilling of these prophecies, because, well, they do, but they're doing so in a world where the legitimacy of the prophecies are never in doubt. In Macbeth, for example, not only are the witches clearly presented as supernatural creatures in a play written during a time when witchcraft was a very real fear of some of the population, but tangible evidence is provided by the fulfillment of a very specific prophecy almost immediately after they give it. They predict that Macbeth will be Thane of Cawdor, and what do you know?
Thane of Cawdor.
Exactly. Which is why What Remains of Edith Finch, the 2017 game by Giant Sparrow, was so refreshing, as by the end of the game, you're left without a concrete explanation as to the nature of a supposed curse upon the titular family, while still presented with an ending that is satisfying and fulfilling. It offers a great insight into how to cope with emotions like grief and guilt, as well as the inevitability of death and the fear that such an obsession can bring to your everyday life. Before we go further, I just want to mention that the game is a great experience and one that I would wholeheartedly recommend, preferably to be completed in one sitting and on your own, but that's just me. It's not a horror game, it's not about jump scares or anything like that, but it's a complete experience and one that is absolutely worth experiencing at your own pace. Consider this the spoiler warning, because I promise that this is a game worth going into blind, but for those who have already played it for themselves, or people who just don't listen, let's get into it. The game follows the journey of Edith Finch, a young woman who, upon returning to her old family home, attempts to uncover the stories of her deceased relatives, all of whom died in accordance with an alleged curse that had dogged the family for generations. You'll notice the word I just used, alleged. Although you play as each of the family members who lost their lives, and some of their stories do contain supernatural elements, the game ends without a conclusion as to the nature of this curse, or even if it's real or not. But instead of feeling unsatisfying, this open-ended resolution allows the deaths to feel tragic and grounded in the real world, whilst the simple idea of a curse remains under everything you do, like an elephant in the room, constantly stalking your actions as you work your way around the house. The uncertainty of it all is what builds the tension as you go from room to room. Perhaps there isn't even a curse at all, but the game fosters just enough doubt to stick in the back of your mind, and the mere possibility of a curse is a chilling thought. It's Lovecraftian in a sense, relying on the simple idea that what you don't know is far scarier than something so easily definable. I mentioned earlier about a self-fulfilling prophecy, and what I think is interesting is that there's an argument that this curse fits that description, that the fear of it actually begins to cause deaths that in turn feed the fire further. The most obvious case of this is with the death of Walter, who retreats to a bunker underneath the house after being traumatized by the death of his sister. After 30 years in hiding, he finally plucks up the courage to leave, only to be killed by a train whilst attempting to leave the tunnel. This interpretation of the curse also has more subtle effects. The youngest Finch to die, Gregory, drowns in his bath whilst his parents are arguing outside the bathroom. Whilst the voices are muffled and you can only hear his mother, Kay, as Sam Finch is on the other end of a phone, you do hear Kay accuse Sam of acting ridiculous and references his entire family, suggesting that Sam's paranoia over the curse has led to their divorce and ultimately arguments like this, all occurring whilst their baby was in the bath alone. Edith's brother Lewis shared in Kay's distrust of the family dogma. It's mentioned that he embraced the Indian heritage of his father, which Edith later paints as a way to distance himself from being
just a Finch.
Perhaps the greatest damage of the curse, the greatest effect it had on the Finches, outside of, killing them, was the air of passivity that would surely arrive after enough family members had died. Why bother with anything, let alone keeping yourself safe, when the family curse will get you in the end, striking even in the most mundane of situations? This terrible limbo, locked into a repetitive, boring life, whilst also dealing with the spectre of a supernatural curse, would be hard to manage for anyone, especially as the legend became more entrenched further down the generations. A character like Lewis knew this feeling all too well. A few characters try to reckon with the curse as a force to confront rather than simply to be affected by, but it was Dawn Finch who actually tried to distance the remainder of her family from it. She saw the curse as deriving its power from their view of their own family history. Her actions present the antithesis to the view of her grandma and Edith's great-grandma Edie, with these opposing views on death being embodied by the two Finch matriarchs. Dawn clashed with Edie, disliking her overexposing the children to her stories, fearing that they did more harm than good, fostering a deadly mix of reverence and fear. She was the one who sealed up all the bedrooms following the disappearance of her son, Milton, whereas Edie preferred to memorialise the dead family members and blame their death solely on the curse. Why would anyone do this? What are the benefits, if you could even call them that, of such a morbid construction? Well, I think at its heart, the curse is about grief, and how people try to control the narrative of death after it causes so much pain and wrestles that feeling of control away from those affected by it. The family can't control the fate of whoever has died, but at least they can exert some minimal control in the construction of a narrative to make those deaths feel a little less random, a little less unfair. Now obviously the end result is seen to be a complete 180, a fear of the curse, but I can see how for some it could function as an almost reassuring concept. The idea that all these deaths happen to serve a larger, more ethereal concept, rather than happening for no apparent reason. Deaths like that of Sven, or Calvin, or Gus, or Sam are served well by the curse. The deaths are all unlucky, of course, both to have happened at all and to have happened alongside each other, but falling from cliffs or hills, being caught by debris in a storm, being crushed whilst building, these things do happen. It's possible to write them off as a sequence of unlikely, unlucky, but ultimately plausible events. These are the deaths that more often occur in the real world, free from any supernatural elements, both real or imagined, and also not so unlikely as to be rendered almost unbelievable, like the deaths of Barbara or Walter. People get murdered, of course, and they also get hit by trains, but the sensational presentation of Barbara's death obscures any realism in her story, whilst the underground bunker does the same to Walter. When your only other explanation relies on a concept as unpredictable and inexplicable as luck, the curse can step in and give a small sense of reason to try and make sense of why these things keep on happening. I think that the case of Milton might be the best and most obvious example of this, as he is the only Finch to have disappeared without ever being found dead, or alive of course. His fate remains a mystery despite Dawn's attempts to find him for months afterwards. His missing posters are all over the house after all. In the absence of any clear explanation, anything would be considered to answer the heartbreaking question of his disappearance, the nature of his whereabouts, whether he's even alive at all. You can see the attraction of such a conclusion, however fantastical. The image of him drawing the door and walking in, never to be seen again, is beautiful in its simplicity. You can see how a grieving grandmother like Edie, already entrenched in the idea of a curse, could be comforted by this idea of Milton surviving in one form or another. And you can also see how Dawn, whilst trying to find her son and being constantly told that it was part of the old family curse striking again, could become enraged by this lack of both the practical solution and the ability to process her own grief outside of the Finch family narrative. The fact that this was what had happened to several of her relatives would not have made the disappearance of her son any easier. For a woman like Edie, though, there's another attraction to the idea of the curse. So, I tried not to watch any other videos on this game when I was writing this. I didn't want to accidentally plagiarise anyone, but I couldn't help watching the game theory video on it because, well, I used to love that channel when I was younger. Their video came up with the theory that not only was the curse fictional, but it was covering up the actions of Edie, who was actively killing the members of her family that tried to disprove her idea of a curse, that obscured her previous neglect, pointing to the various newspaper clippings around the house as evidence that she loved the attention that the curse brought on her personally as the Finch matriarch. Now, I don't agree with this theory, not that that's a problem of course, each to their own, and having watched the show for years I know that it's just a bit of fun and a more outlandish theory is, well, more fun, but there was one point that I did agree on, sort of. The video paints Edie as neglectful, and while I don't think that's completely fair, her actions in the game make it obvious as to why she is the main supporter of the curse. For example, the main catalyst for Molly's death, or whether by supernatural means or not, is her being sent to bed without dinner by Edie, her mother. The more grounded explanation for her death, and probably the way it would have looked to her parents when they found her, was that she died from the things she ate in her room because she was so hungry. Now, I don't think withholding food from your child should ever be used as a punishment, but I know that being sent to bed without dinner has been used by a lot of parents, and even though this was obviously not the intention, Edie, like almost any other mother in this situation, would undoubtedly feel guilty for her daughter's death. Her other daughter, Barbara, was also killed, and regardless of the exact nature of the killing, it happened whilst Edie was out of the house tending to her husband at the hospital. This is obviously not Edie's fault, but with the guilt already surrounding Molly, it could be expected that she would feel further guilt for not being with Barbara at this time, that she was unable to defend her daughter, however unfair this criticism is of herself. With this guilt, the feeling of being unable to protect her family, is it any wonder that she supports her son's decision to hide away, especially after the death of her husband, who died 4 years before Walter went underground? A lot of this is obviously speculation, and I'm not saying that Edie invented the curse to absolve herself of any blame in her children's deaths, however warranted. Rather, I'm suggesting that her adoption of the already conceived curse could help her cope with the guilt that she already felt. The idea that the deaths were not entirely her fault, even though she might feel partially to blame. This isn't a theory after all, just an analysis. Not only are these themes and ideas presented perfectly in their chosen format, but they're also explored in a way that feels unique for a video game, if nothing else because of how successfully they're depicted. I tried to imagine this story as a book or a film, and it just didn't feel right. The plot would turn into a rather repetitive sequence of reveals. A relative and how they died, a relative and how they died, and so on, until the final reveal of the narrator would just feel cheap. But as a game, suddenly the story isn't about Edith, really, it's about you. The protagonist ultimately being guided by Edith, rather than you being Edith herself, introduces the agency that makes these discoveries feel earned. The developers are able to create pictures of each relative through their bedrooms without using too much dialogue, with the game allowing players to explore these spaces endlessly if they wish. Any other medium would have to make the choice of how long to spend on these characters. Too much time in the room would be boring, too little would leave them underdeveloped, and relying on exposition to flesh out their personalities would just be lazy. The simple fact of this story being interactive is also a huge asset. For one thing, it heightens the weight of each death, deaths which could perhaps become repetitive or lose their significance in a lesser game. For a medium so reliant on dying and being able to restart, it makes for an eerie atmosphere when you die and can't come back. Each death in the game is final. Not only that, but thanks to the narrative, each death builds on the previous one. The curse is literally making its way down the family tree, tinging your grief, like that of the families, with the fear of a seemingly unstoppable curse coming ever closer. The use of the house to encourage an inference on the part of the player before then fleshing these characters out further through the flashbacks allows for a subtlety that is never too indirect. The subsequent vignettes answer questions without ever invalidating the earlier exploration from the player. In this way, the game does both showing and then telling. When you see Gregory's empty crib, for example, you are given the tools to come to your own conclusion and presented with an image that is visceral and harrowing without ever being graphic. You don't need to see a dead baby for an image like this, given what we already know about the family, to be heartbreaking. When the deaths are then shown, most of them are obscured or told in a way that leaves some sense of doubt as to their true fate. Seeing Gregory in the bath, only to then be confronted with the toy frog, adds a certain layer of mystery depending on how literal you believe the curse to be. Maybe it is an example of a supernatural occurrence, but if not, and it's worth noting that the most blatantly magic examples of death are associated with the youngest members of the Finch family, then we still have to fill in a small gap that has been left by these inclusions. I suppose it is an obvious design choice, as taking on the role of Gregory and simply waiting to drown would be very distasteful, but that doesn't mean that it isn't worth celebrating anyway. Events like these also inject an air of whimsy that contrasts beautifully with the harsh reality of the situation. The music being played during the flashback, Waltz of the Flowers by Tchaikovsky, cultivates the mood perfectly. I mean, just listen to it. The dramatic irony is so powerful. As Gregory enjoys a happy, fun game, the player is fully aware of what's about to happen. When I first finished this game, I was desperate for another title that could accomplish everything that this one had just done. In many ways, this game satisfied a set of criteria that I never even knew I had. I've since found a few games that elicit a similar feeling and have their own strengths as well, but never one that has registered with me quite like this one. It's the perfect fit of a medium that best serves the narrative being presented, a narrative which in turn bolsters the game against the problems that plague other similar titles. The constant tension of the family curse, the storytelling that revolves around the environments you explore, the questions that you ponder as you delve deeper into the house. These are all apparent alongside incredibly atmospheric visuals and music. The visuals in particular are a point of praise. They look great. Fair enough, they're not the most groundbreaking graphics ever seen in a game, but I appreciate their realism and the attention to detail given to the house. Games are expensive, and making a realistic looking world in service of such a small game is admirable. I don't mean small as an insult, but this is not a game that can be played online or milked for constant income through season passes or loot boxes. It's one short story that really only needs to be played once, and yet no expense has been noticeably spared in crafting it. This is not to criticise games with more stylised visuals or games that utilise a retro aesthetic, but it's clear that Edith Finch benefits from the realism displayed here and the time and money afforded to it. It's also, as mentioned, a relatively short game, able to be completed in a few hours, meaning that it never descends into drudgery or monotony. It stays focused throughout. Such a concentrated stream of emotion, like I said earlier, I feel like it's best experienced in one sitting, works far better for not being stretched thinly across several hours, as is so often the case with other games. I'm not going to argue that video games can't have engaging stories, that would just be untrue, but they obviously need to adapt their narrative structure in order to prioritise their gameplay and mechanics. Participating in fetch quests, getting players to complete arbitrary missions to unlock new areas, helping new characters in order to gain their support, these all exist to facilitate the slow drip of plot information in a way that allows the game to be prolonged and the player to fully enjoy the mechanics and gameplay loops on offer, even if these devices do prolong the story and would be cut if the focus was solely on cultivating a tight narrative. Games that are built on progression and a slow mastery of skills require longer stories, even if these stories are merely written to accommodate the game that exists around them. What Remains of Edith Finch doesn't have that problem. It exists as an individual experience, one that, as mentioned before, benefits from its presentation as an interactive game. A character like Lewis embodies these strengths better perhaps than anyone else in the game. How better to show the repetition of his life than having the player perform their own task over and over whilst his daydream slowly takes over the whole screen, as it did in his mind. Maybe it's cheating to praise a game for being more immersive than any other medium. The very nature of a video game obviously requires input from the player, but I've played so many games that fail to grip me, that give away too little and become boring, or give away too much and become predictable and dull. What Remains of Edith Finch, however, is a masterclass in immersive storytelling. When I started writing this, I didn't really know what I wanted to say about this game. I just wanted to talk about it, so I do apologise for the slight rambling quality of this video. There's so much that this game accomplishes in its narrative and in the themes explored, but also in its construction and presentation, that I knew I couldn't do it justice. I tried to keep the spoilers to a minimum. I purposefully didn't go into detail over every death in the game because, as much as I love talking about it, I do think that it works best as an individual experience that should be played to be enjoyed. I'd love to dissect more games like this. There are some that I think I could provide a sharper focus to, but I wanted to just explore a great game in as many aspects as possible, as I'm sure others have done, without leaning into the whole game theory conspiracy route. I don't really think I made any controversial points, but if I did, then I would point out that this is all just my opinion, and I wasn't even trying to be very opinionated. I just wanted to talk about a game that I loved when I first played it, and love now as I've read and written about it. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it, and if you've gotten all the way to the end having not played the game, firstly, I'm flattered, but secondly, just go and play the game. Honestly, just go and play it. A couple of hours, just a great experience. It's great. Highly recommended. If that wasn't already clear from the full video essay I just made on it. Yeah. Thanks for watching.